Nothing is being done to stop the climate and ecological crisis.
Humanity will be annihilated if we fail to ban plastic bottles.
2020 was a great year for fearmongers. It was a year that put emergencies at the front and centre of politics. And it was a year in which politicians discovered a new way to handle any kind of emergency. It was the year of the lockdown, and it has been celebrated by green politicians and campaigners all over the world. It has grounded planes, closed roads, destroyed industries, and locked people in their homes, exactly what green campaigners have been campaigning for decades. But 2020 was also a landmark date chosen for historical climate predictions. According to these predictions, 2020 would be the year that climate change reality would hit us. 2020 then gave us an opportunity to examine some key green predictions. In 1978, an article in the prestigious journal Science claimed that by 2020, atmospheric CO2 levels will have doubled, and that by the middle of the century, in just 30 years' time, CO2 levels will be 5 to 10 times higher. Claims such as these helped to set global warming on the international political agenda, and journalists were keen to explain to the public that a disaster was unfolding. But 40 years later, CO2 levels in the atmosphere have increased only by a third, very far from the scientists' apocalyptic prediction. By 1986, alarmism had gathered momentum. Scientists at the United States Environmental Protection Agency predicted that Florida would see 2 feet of sea level rise by 2020. But since that prediction, Florida saw just 3 inches of sea level rise, much of which has been attributed to land subsidence, not to climate change. The following year, in 1987, journalists quoted NASA climate scientist James Hansen, who predicted that by 2020, the world would be 3 degrees warmer. Different datasets disagree about how much warming there has been, but they show significantly less than 3 degrees of warming. In 2000, a scientist predicted that by 2020, British children would no longer know what snow is. But as 2020 drew to a close, newspapers across Britain, from the south coast, through North Wales, across to the east and up to Scotland, reported the Met Office's prediction of significant snowfall. Later in 2000, newspapers reported a Greenpeace study which claimed that because of climate change, by 2020 some Melanesian nations could lose between 15 and 20% of their gross domestic product. But the 2000s and 2010s were good economic times for the region. Each Melanesian economy showed substantial and unprecedented economic growth, contrary to Greenpeace's dire predictions. In 2004, The Observer claimed that they had obtained a secret Pentagon report. The secret report warned that by 2020, major European cities would be sunk beneath rising seas, and that Britain would be plunged into a Siberian climate. It also claimed that there would be nuclear conflict, and that megadroughts, famine and widespread rioting would erupt across the world. It is cold in Britain right now, but with lows of minus 32 degrees centigrade predicted for Siberia over the next few days, Britain seems hot by contrast. And at the time of this video's production, no European city is reported to have sunk beneath the waves, and reports of nuclear war have... The Guardian. In 2008, newspapers reported that the snow on Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania would disappear by 2020. It's still there. The next year, gloomy reports from environmental scientists claimed that Glacier National Park in Montana would be free of glaciers by the 2020s. The glaciers are still there. The only thing that has gone are the signs that the park's managers have installed, alerting visitors to the dangers of climate change and the glacier's imminent collapse. At the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting in Copenhagen later in 2009, hopes of a new global agreement were high. China pledged that by 2020 it would reduce CO2 emissions by 45% based on 2005 business-as-usual measurements of carbon intensity, and India followed suit, offering to slow its emissions growth by 25%. But over the next 11 years, China's emissions rose by 85%, and India's rose by 150%. In 2013, a study published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters projected a nearly ice-free summer Arctic Ocean before 2020. But in September 2020, the month in which Arctic sea ice extent is the lowest, there remained nearly 4 million square miles of Arctic sea ice. Yet another climate change prediction has passed without event. None of these false claims makes the case that there is no such thing as global warming, or that climate change is not a problem. But what they do show is that people who make these and similar alarmist claims, and the organisations that publish and promote them, suffer no consequences for misinforming public debate and national and global policy making. They were not trivial errors such as typos or transcription mistakes, misremembering facts, or accidentally getting timescales or events muddled up. They were claims made not by people who do not know any better, but by experts, academics, scientists, scientific institutions, government agencies, international campaigning organisations, senior politicians, and global news media companies. Whether or not these kind of claims are made in bad faith, they follow a pattern of a half-century history of apocalyptic scaremongering that has gone unchallenged in the mainstream. It is the absence of any motivation from powerful individuals, institutions, and governments to challenge that scaremongering that exposes the fact that alarmist claims are produced not by science, but by ideology. Rather than facing consequences such as harm to reputation or career, or a reduced public standing, individuals and institutions that produce dire, alarmist predictions that fail to materialize are instead rewarded, celebrated, and promoted.